everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a solved case from the state of Iowa when a beautiful young woman was found brutally murdered outside of a shopping mall one night in late 1979. A homicide investigation was swiftly launched by the police to try and track down her killer. But despite having a number of suspects at the time, her case tragically went cold, leaving the family of the victim without answers or closure for years and years. That was until a cold case team of detectives turned to new DNA techniques. They got old evidence back out of storage and hoped that they would be able to use it and the advancements in forensic science to solve this case once and for all. And luckily they had a breakthrough, and decades after this horrific murder, police were finally able to narrow down the search for the perpetrator. And it was someone that no one could have seen coming. This individual really did not seem like the type that could have been capable of carrying out such a vicious crime, and yet the evidence indicated otherwise. Join me as we delve into the tragic case of Martinko. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a big thank you to AG1 for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Now, if you are anything like me, you will associate a brand new year with almost being like a fresh start, a time where you really want to focus on new goals, building better habits, and making positive changes to your routine and for your health. And AG1 is 100% something that is going to be a staple part of my everyday routine for 2025. AG1 is a nutritional healthy drink designed by scientists with over 70 high quality ingredients. It contains vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, as well as gut friendly bacteria and more, all of which can help to support your immune health and digestive regularity, but also your energy levels and just overall mood. And like I said, AG1 is just a part of my everyday routine now. I wake up in the morning and one of the first things that I do is make my AG1 drink. It's so easy and simple. It's just one scoop into a bottle of water, you give it a quick shake and it's ready. So whether I'm having a relaxing morning chilling at home, or I'm behind my desk starting work, or I've gone out for a walk, my AG1 drink comes with me wherever I go. And honestly, I feel like it just sets me up for the day ahead. It makes me feel like I've already had a positive start to the day because I've already done something good that is going to help support my body and give me the focus and energy that I need. And you know what? It actually tastes really good as well. I am always skeptical that drinks like this are just going to taste gross. Like, yeah, they are good for you, but do they actually taste nice? Well, I can confirm that AG1 does. To me, AG1 just kind of tastes like squash or juice. A really nice, refreshing beverage with little hints of vanilla and pineapple. So if you would like to give AG1 a try for yourself, and I highly recommend that you do, then you can go to drinkag1.com/Mollie Westbrook to get a free bottle of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. The link to the AG1 website will also be at the top line of the description box. Thank you so much once again to AG1 for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to all of you guys watching for always showing your support to the sponsors that we work with on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video contains heavy themes such as rape and sexual assault. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back more than 4.5 decades now to late 1979 in Cedar Rapids, which is a city located in Linn County in the state of Iowa in the US. And this is Michelle Marie Martinko. She was an 18-year-old girl who was born and raised in Cedar Rapids. Michelle was born to parents Albert and Janet Martinko on the 6th of October 1961, and she was one of 2 children. She had a big sister named Janelle, who was quite a bit older than Michelle actually. She was about 12 years older. The reason there was such a big age gap between them was because Michelle's parents, Albert and Janet, sadly suffered about 5 miscarriages before Michelle came along. So as you can imagine, it was absolutely devastating for them. They were so desperate for a second child. So when Michelle was eventually born in 1961, she was literally called the miracle baby of the family. She really seemed to just complete especially the Martinko clan. I couldn't really find much information online about Michelle's upbringing, so as far as I'm aware, she just had a nice normal childhood. Although life took a bit of a turn for Michelle when she was around 12 years old, as that was when she was diagnosed with scoliosis, which is a condition that causes a person's spine to like twist and curve to the side rather than stay straight. And as a result of this, she had to wear this metal brace for a few years to straighten out her spine, which was really tough for her. She hated it, to be honest. Her sister Janelle said that having this brace just made her feel really self-conscious. It made her feel like she stood out, and yeah, it really affected her self-confidence, I think. So when she could finally have the brace taken off at 14 years old, she was so incredibly relieved, and it was almost like she was a completely different girl. As she went through her teens, she started to find her own style. She was described as being very much a girly girl. She loved makeup, she loved getting dressed up, she loved styling her big blonde hair. I mean, she was an incredibly beautiful young woman. That was something that everyone said about Michelle. She was absolutely striking. But her sister Janelle and brother-in-law John said that Michelle was kind of blissfully unaware of just how beautiful she was. By the time she was 18 years old, you know, she was getting a lot of attention from boys, making a lot of heads turn as she walked past, but yeah, she was just kind of oblivious to it. She was a gorgeous young woman, but she wasn't arrogant or anything. She was beautiful inside and out. Michelle was also described as being a very bright and friendly person. She was a student at the Kennedy High School in Cedar Rapids with plans to attend the Iowa State University after she graduated. And she was also a very talented young woman. She seemed to love all things kind of music and theatre related. She was part of the baton twirling squad in school, and she absolutely adored singing, so much so that she was a member of the Kennedy Concert Choir, which she loved. She loved being a part of the choir. And in fact, on the day that this case occurred, Michelle happened to have an event on that was related to the choir. The date was the 19th of December 1979. It was a Wednesday, and that Wednesday evening, Michelle got all dressed up to attend this holiday banquet that her choir group was hosting in Cedar Rapids. Obviously, it was less than a week before Christmas, and so the choir group decided to all get together and celebrate and enjoy some food and drinks, and by all accounts, Michelle had a really nice night. And then after the banquet ended, Michelle actually decided to head to the Westdale shopping mall in Cedar Rapids, which I think had only recently opened, actually, about 2 months earlier. Basically, her mother Janet had brought Michelle this coat for Christmas from one of the shopping mall stores. Well, she put it on layaway, so she'd put a deposit down for this coat, and then Michelle was going to go and pay the rest of the money for it that evening and pick it up. So she left the banquet, she drove to the mall in her family's tan and green coloured 1972 Buick Electra car, and she walked into the mall with about $186 in cash to pay for this coat. Although by the time she got to the mall, she decided that actually she didn't really want the coat anymore, so she didn't collect it in the end. So she just started having a wander around some of the other shops. She chatted with some of her friends who worked in the mall, including a guy named Tracy Price and another guy named Kurt Thomas. I believe they both went to school with Michelle. And in fact, when Michelle eventually left the shopping mall sometime between like 9 and 10 p.m, Kurt Thomas actually walked her to the mall exit, and he said goodbye as Michelle headed off to her car in the parking lot to drive home. However, as it would turn out, Kurt Thomas would actually be the last person to ever see 18-year-old Michelle Martinko alive, as she never made it home that night. She never returned home after her trip to the Westdale shopping mall. Of course, when she didn't return home, her parents Albert and Janet became very concerned. They waited for a few hours just hoping that Michelle would soon turn up, but she never did. There was absolutely no sign of her. And so, fearing that something bad may have happened, her parents contacted the police at around 2 in the morning on the 20th of December, and they reported their teenage daughter as missing. Michelle's father Albert immediately went out searching for Michelle, and quickly police officers joined the search too. And of course, the first, or one of the first places that they headed to was the mall, the Westdale shopping mall, because her parents knew that she was headed there that night. And when they arrived at the mall around 4 a.m, the police actually noticed that the car Michelle had been driving, the Buick Electra, was still parked in the parking lot. And when they got close closer, when they approached the car, they realized that Michelle herself was inside amongst a truly terrifying scene. Michelle was found dead. She was dead inside of her own car. She'd been killed in what was clearly an incredibly brutal and violent attack. Michelle was covered, absolutely covered in blood. There was blood all over the car interior, so it was clear that she'd been attacked and killed inside of the vehicle. She was still wearing the clothes that she'd been wearing to the banquet and the mall that night. She had on this black jersey dress and this white and brown fur coat, and she had been repeatedly stabbed. It was later determined that she sustained more than 20 stab wounds to her body. Some sources even state that she had about 29 stab wounds in total. She'd been stabbed in her chest, in her neck, in her face. She had stab wounds and cuts to her arms, where it was obvious that she'd put up such a fight against her attacker. She really tried to defend herself and fight for her life. It was clear that she had been attacked very shortly after she left the mall on the evening of the 19th. It looked like she'd made it back to her car. She'd gotten inside, was probably about to start the engine and leave, and that was when her killer, whoever they were, jumped in the passenger seat beside her and immediately began this ferocious attack. This poor 18-year-old girl had been the victim of a truly savage and sickening homicide. But why? Why on earth would someone have wanted Michelle Martinko dead? Following the launch of a murder inquiry by the Cedar Rapids police, the detectives immediately began coming up with different theories and possible motives for this crime. They were able to pretty much rule out a robbery motive here due to the fact that that $180 that Michelle had taken to the mall to pay for that coat was still in her car. The killer hadn't taken that money. She had also purchased some items from the mall that night, which was still in a bag in her car. They hadn't been stolen. They also considered the possibility that perhaps there was a sexual motive to Michelle's murder, although the medical examiner did conclude that Michelle hadn't been assaulted in that way. There was no evidence of sexual assault. That doesn't necessarily mean that the motive wasn't sexual, though. It's very possible that that was the killer's intention. They intended to sexually assault Michelle in the car, but perhaps they were unable to because she was fighting back so much. What did become clear to the investigators was that this killer came prepared to the scene. I mean, they obviously came armed with some kind of weapon, likely a knife, and it also appeared as though they wore rubber gloves when they carried out this murder, as no fingerprints belonging to the perpetrator were found. And in fact, rubber glove impressions in blood and dirt were discovered both on the inside and the outside of the vehicle. So the fact that they wore gloves suggested that this attack may have very well been planned and carefully thought out. Does that mean that Michelle was likely killed by someone that she knew? Well, that's what the evidence seemed to indicate. I mean, the fact that she was stabbed so many times, stabbed over and over and over again, really made it seem as though this attack was personal. The killer felt some sort of personal rage towards Michelle. They were angry at her and they were taking that anger out on her body with every jab of the knife. As you would expect, as soon as a murder investigation was launched, the police's immediate inquiries involved taking a very close look at the people in Michelle's life. The men in particular, trying to work out if any of them could have been responsible. And there were a few guys that seemed to quickly become potential suspects and people of interest, the main one being Michelle's ex-boyfriend, a 19-year-old boy named Andy Seidel. Now, Andy and Michelle met about 3 years before this case took place, when she was around 15 years old and he was 16. They actually met at a roller skating rink. They ultimately ended up dating. They became a couple and they remained a couple for about 2 years. However, things ended between them when Michelle decided that she just didn't really want a relationship anymore. You know, she was so young and she just wanted to be single for a while, and so she broke up with Andy Seidel. And to say that Andy did not take this well would be an understatement. He was so upset that Michelle had split up with him. He didn't want to be apart from her, and so even after they split, he just refused to leave her alone, pretty much. He would do everything that he could to kind of find out what was going on in her life. He would speak to Michelle's friends, trying to find out if there were any other guys on the scene. He was just quite obsessed with her, to be honest. And what the police would actually find out when they took a statement from Andy Seidel was that he had actually been to to the Westdale Mall on the night that Michelle was there, the night that she was killed. Apparently they ran into each other. I think they had a very brief interaction, and then Andy claimed that from there he went straight home, and he was home for the rest of the night. He was home at the time that Michelle was murdered in the parking lot, and he denied being her killer. And his mother confirmed this. She confirmed that yes, Andy was home when Michelle would have been killed. However, understandably, the police couldn't take this statement from Andy's mother as gospel. They couldn't rule him out based on this alibi alone, because there's every possibility that his mother could have been lying to protect him. So Andy Seidel couldn't be eliminated as a suspect, and he also seemed to have a potential motive for carrying out this crime. He was really upset when Michelle broke up with him. So was this a classic case of, if I can't have you, then no one can, and I'm going to make sure of that? I mean, we know that he was desperately trying to find out if there were any other guys that Michelle had been seeing. Speaking of other guys, there were a few more that were considered people of interest in Michelle's case. There were the guys that spoke to her at the mall that evening, her friends, including Kurt Thomas, who walked her to the mall exit and who was obviously the last person to see her alive. He was looked at by the police. There was also another guy that Michelle had dated in the past who was looked at. His name was Mike Wyrick, although it was ultimately confirmed that he wasn't even in the area at the time. He wasn't in Cedar Rapids on the night of the killing, so his alibi seemed to be pretty airtight. But yeah, there were a lot of men that were looked into, but none investigated so extensively as Andy Seidel. He really seemed to be the top suspect in the case, not even necessarily for the detectives, I don't think. I mean, he was a good suspect for the detectives, but to be honest, it was more so the public. The local community and the majority of Michelle's friends and family really believed that Andy was the one responsible. Michelle's sister Janelle believed Andy was the killer. Michelle's parents believed he was the killer. But the issue was the police just didn't have the solid evidence to prove it. Of course, Michelle was killed in the late 70s when investigators didn't have the use of forensic science yet to link suspects to crimes. They obviously didn't have any fingerprint evidence in the car, and there was no other concrete evidence to tie Andy to the murder. So they couldn't arrest him because they wouldn't be able to take him to trial without evidence. And so Andy Seidel just kind of lived under this cloud of suspicion for what would be years and years, as tragically Michelle Martinko's case remained unsolved and ultimately ended up going cold. Michelle's family were just left in the dark without any answers and any justice for her death. And if that wasn't heartbreaking enough, Michelle's loved ones were also subjected to the most horrendous prank calls following Michelle's murder. Naturally, news of this young woman's murder spread rapidly across the state of Iowa. Practically everyone knew about what had happened to Michelle Martinko, which, you know, for the most part is a really good thing in a homicide investigation. The police need people to be aware of the case because that way more tips and leads for them to investigate pour in. However, Michelle's mother Janet said that in the months and the years after Michelle was killed, she would get so many phone calls from people who would literally pretend to be her murdered daughter. Janet would pick up the phone and she would hear someone on the other end of the line saying, "Mother, mother, it's Michelle," and then they would laugh and just hang up the phone, which is just insane, isn't it? It's unbelievable. The fact that there are people out there that can do something like that. Think that it's funny to harass and prank call the family of a murder victim, a family who are already going through so much pain and torment, and to just cause them even more anguish. It's vile and sickening. Honestly, that really made my heart break for Janet's mother. What an awful thing to do to someone. But yeah, the police looked into the several tips and leads that came in from the public, but they all just resulted in dead ends, really. They interviewed countless people. They even offered a $10,000 reward for information, but as I said, years passed by and the police just couldn't identify the perpetrator. And tragically, in the mid to late 90s, both Michelle's mother and father passed away. Albert Martinko passed in 1995 and his wife Janet passed in 1998, and they both died having never seen justice for their their daughter, never finding out who had taken her life that night in 1979. 26 years after the murder in 2005, a cold case team was assigned to Michelle's case, with Detective Doug Larison leading the investigation. And whilst he was reviewing Michelle's case files and going over all of the old evidence, to his surprise, he actually discovered blood scrapings which had been taken from Michelle's car following her murder. In particular, there were scrapings and samples of blood which had been taken from the gear shift in the vehicle. Now, obviously, back in the late 70s, the police couldn't do anything with this evidence, but by this time, by 2005/2006, forensic science had come a long way, and so Detective Larison decided to send these scrapings off to the lab for testing. And guess what scientists discovered? On the blood scrapings taken from the gear shift, they discovered an unidentified DNA profile. There was blood on this gear shift that wasn't a match to the victim. It wasn't Michelle's blood, so it must have been her killer's. It was male DNA, but that wasn't all. When Michelle's black dress was taken out of storage and sent off for testing, scientists also discovered a spot of blood on there that again did not match Michelle. It was this same unidentified male DNA. So this blood evidence indicated that the killer must have accidentally cut himself during the murder, during the struggle with Michelle. Clearly the knife slipped and he was cut and he started bleeding. I mean, it's thanks to Michelle, really, that this evidence was found. If she hadn't fought so hard with her attacker, then he most likely wouldn't have cut himself, and the police wouldn't have this blood evidence, this huge breakthrough in the case. They had the killer's DNA profile. So, of course, the first thing they wanted to do with it was enter it onto the CODIS database, the National DNA Database, to see if there would be a match on there. But alas, there wasn't. And so, as that was a dead end, the cold case team then started to revisit the previous suspects and people of interest in the case. They reached out to them and asked if they would provide a voluntary DNA sample so that their DNA could be tested against the DNA of the offender. They took DNA samples from more than 100 people in total, including Michelle's brother-in-law John, Tracy Price, Kurt Thomas, the two guys who saw her at the mall that night. They took a DNA sample from Michelle's exes, Mike Wyrick and Andy Seidel. However, none of them were a match. Not even Andy Seidel, the man that practically everyone believed was the killer, was innocent. His DNA was not a match. Like I said before, he spent years and years living under this cloud of suspicion, but he really was telling the truth. He really had nothing to do with Michelle's murder. And because no one else in Michelle's life seemed to match the DNA, it was looking more and more likely that the killer was a complete stranger to Michelle. They didn't think initially that it would be, given the brutality of the attack. But yeah, because there were no matches, it seemed like the perpetrator probably didn't know Michelle personally. He was a stranger to her, a stranger who was probably watching her in the mall that night, or watched and followed her as she left the mall and walked back to her car, and just saw this as the perfect opportunity to strike, I guess. And unfortunately, as there were no matches to the voluntary DNA samples given and no matches on the CODIS system, that meant that once again the case started to go quiet and go cold. Detective Doug Larison worked on this investigation for about 10 years, but by 2015 he described how he just got to the point where he had this mental burnout with the case. He felt like he had done everything that he could do, everything that he could think of to solve it, and sadly he just hadn't been able to. And so he requested for another detective to take over, for a fresh pair of eyes to be put on this inquiry. And a fresh pair of eyes was. That same year, in 2015, a detective named Matt Denlinger was handed Michelle Martinko's case file. And it turns out actually that Matt was only about 5 years old back in 1979 when Michelle was killed, and his father, Harvey Denlinger, was also a detective. Matt had followed in his dad's footsteps and decided that he also wanted to work in the police force, and his dad just happened to be one of the original detectives on the Michelle Martinko investigation back in 1979. And then, yeah, 36 years later, his his son was tasked with leading the case. But yeah, anyway, Detective Denlinger took over the case in 2015, by which time forensic science had obviously progressed and advanced even more. And in 2017, Detective Denlinger reached out to Parabon Nanolabs for their help, as he wanted to use a technique called DNA phenotyping to hopefully provide a breakthrough in this case. And we actually spoke about Parabon and their use of DNA phenotyping literally in my last video, the video about Eric Goldstrand and Liana Adang. But in case you haven't seen that video yet, or you need a reminder, DNA phenotyping is a process used by scientists to try and predict what the owner of an unidentified DNA profile looks like. They do this through analysing the DNA sequence and genetic information of a profile, and they can predict what the person's eye colour might have been, their hair colour, skin tone, origin, etc. And then using this, they will create a composite image of the person, and that is exactly what Parabon did in this case. Detective Denlinger gave them the killer's DNA profile, and they created this image of the offender, of what they believed he may have looked like. They created 3 images actually, 2 which showed what the killer may have looked like around age 25 with 2 different kinds of hairstyles, if he was around 25 years old at the time of the killing, and then the 3rd composite was what the killer may look like in more recent times as he would have aged, because obviously it had been approaching nearly 4 decades since the crime by this point. So a press conference was held, the police made these composite images public, and as a result, various tips and leads came in. People were saying, oh, the composite looks like this person, or it could have been this guy, but unfortunately every single tip was looked into and they never led anywhere. It was once again just dead end after dead end. But the fight for justice and the search for answers was far from over for Detective Denlinger. Just the year following, in 2018, he once again asked for Parabon's help in using genetic genealogy to track down the perpetrator. And so Parabon took the killer's DNA profile and they uploaded it onto a public genealogy database called GEDmatch, which is basically a website where people can put together their family trees. You can submit your DNA sample and GEDmatch will use it to find your distant relatives. And so Detective Denlinger was hopeful that Parabon might be able to find relatives of Michelle's killer, and as luck would have it, that's exactly what they did. Through searching GEDmatch, they were able to find a partial match to the killer's DNA, a familial match to a woman that had submitted her DNA onto the genealogy database. Her name was Brandy Jennings and she lived in Vancouver in the state of Washington, and Parabon were able to determine that she was a second cousin once removed to the murderer. And so now the detectives had this starting point. They could start to build this family tree around Brandy, look at all of her male relatives. They even went back so far as to identifying her great-great-grandparents, and it took months and months to build this family tree, but once they had, Detective Denlinger was able to narrow down the search for the killer to, ironically, 3 brothers. I say ironically because, again, if you watched my last video, in that case, the police were able to narrow down the search to 3 brothers as well. A lot of similarities between last week's case and this week's, it seems. Of course, it wasn't the same 3 brothers. In Michelle's case, the siblings in question were Kenneth, Donald and Jerry Burns. So let's talk a little bit more about our now 3 top suspects in the case, the 3 Burns brothers. Well, they were all originally from Iowa. They grew up in a city called Manchester in Iowa, which is only about 44 miles away from Cedar Rapids, where this case obviously took place. And apparently 2 of the brothers, Kenneth and Jerry Burns, were still living in Manchester by 2018. And to be honest, each one of the brothers just seemed, to an outsider's perspective, to be very nice, respectable family men. None of them had any kind of criminal record, and the police couldn't find any connection between the 3 brothers and the victim, Michelle Martinko. Doesn't seem like any of them knew Michelle prior to her death, and actually all 3 of them were very successful. They had very successful careers. Apparently Donald Burns was an entrepreneur, and Kenneth and Jerry Burns both had their own companies, their own businesses. Again, to an outsider's perspective, perspective, the Burns brothers just seemed like normal, hardworking, friendly men. You wouldn't have thought that any of them would have been capable of committing such a horrendous crime like this one. However, genetic genealogy indicated that one of them was. One of these brothers was the likely killer of Michelle Martinko. So Detective Denglinger now had the task of figuring out which one it was. So in an effort to do this, he decided to launch basically an undercover covert operation whereby he would try and collect secret DNA samples from each of the brothers, because he didn't want the brothers to know that they were being looked at as suspects in this cold case. Detective Denglinger wanted to be armed with DNA evidence before that happened. And so Denglinger and his team started secretly watching and following all three of them and just waiting until they saw them dispose of something that would have their DNA on, like a water bottle or tissue or something like that. They were able to secretly collect a toothbrush and a glass from Donald Burns from his garbage that he left outside of his house for the garbage truck. And for the other two brothers, Kenneth and Jerry Burns, the police followed them as they both went out for lunch separately to different restaurants one day, and they were able to collect a straw that they had each used to drink their drinks. So all of these items containing each brother's DNA was immediately sent to the lab for testing, and sure enough, there was a match. One of these three brothers was an exact match to the DNA profile of the killer, a match to the blood that was found on Michelle Martinko's black dress and to the blood that was discovered on the gear shift in her car. And it was to 65-year-old Jerry Burns, who would have been 25 back in 1979. Donald and Kenneth were eliminated as suspects as their DNA was not an exact match, but Jerry's was. In fact, it was even established that the chances of the DNA on the gear shift and on Michelle's dress belonging to anyone other than Jerry Burns was 1 in 100 billion. And there are only 7 billion people on the planet, so that's a pretty positive identification, isn't it? And so, armed with this DNA evidence, Detective Denglinger went to interview him. He went to speak with him at his business. As I said before, he had his own company in Manchester. I believe it was a powder coating company, something like that. And actually, Detective Denglinger went there. He went to confront Jerry Burns on what was the 39th anniversary of Michelle's death, the 19th of December 2018, which was no accident. That was intentional. I think Denglinger hoped that, you know, if he interviewed Jerry Burns about Michelle's murder on the anniversary, then perhaps that would trigger some kind of emotional reaction and maybe he would be more likely to just confess, who knows. So yeah, he headed there on the 19th of December 2018. He introduced himself to Jerry Burns, explained why he and his colleague were there, that they were part of a cold case team who were investigating the 1979 murder of Michelle Martinko from Cedar Rapids. They started asking him just some kind of vague questions related to the case, like did he ever know Michelle Martinko? Had he seen her face before? And Jerry said that he didn't ever know her personally, but he did recall possibly having seen her face in the news when the murder happened. They also asked him if he had ever been to the mall where her murder occurred before, Westdale Mall, and he said yeah, he and his family went there a couple of times before, but he denied having been there on the night of the killing. And then Denglinger started getting into the DNA evidence. He actually told Jerry that he did have a warrant to be able to get a DNA sample from him, but that they already knew it was going to be a match to the killer's DNA because they'd been able to secretly collect a DNA sample from him recently. And he said that that sample matched the DNA from the Michelle Martinko crime scene, thus implicating Jerry as being the perpetrator. And Jerry's reaction to this was kind of strange. He didn't look really confused. He didn't protest his innocence. I mean, he did deny being the killer. He said that he wasn't there that night, but he was just kind of very, very calm and almost unbothered, I want to say. You know, this is a man that has just been accused of murder of all things, and his reaction was just so, like, well, there was barely a reaction at all, to be honest. The only thing he kept saying was, test the DNA, as in to test the sample that the police had just taken from him. But Detective Denlinger was saying to Jerry, well, yeah, we are going to test it, but we already know that it's going to be a match, Jerry. But still, Jerry Burns would not admit to anything, although that didn't really matter because he was still arrested. That same day after his interview, he was arrested for the murder of 18-year-old Michelle Martinko, and he was taken back to Cedar Rapids and into custody. He was soon charged with first-degree murder. However, the denial continued and Jerry Burns pleaded not guilty, meaning that this case was headed to trial. Now, of course, in the lead up to the trial, the police and the prosecution were doing everything they could to build their case against Jerry Burns, because to be honest, their entire case relied practically solely on the DNA evidence. You know, there was no evidence that Jerry knew Michelle, so they didn't have a clear motive. There were no witnesses who could say that they'd seen Jerry at the mall that night, no witnesses to the crime. We know that he didn't have a criminal record or anything, so the search for evidence continued following his arrest. And as part of this search, the detectives took a look through Jerry Burns's cell phone records and internet search history from 2018. And guess what they found? They discovered that Jerry Burns had Googled some very, very disturbing things all about blonde women being sexually assaulted. He'd Googled things like, quote, blonde molested after getting strangled and, quote, sex with freshly dead person. He was trying to access pornography which depicted blonde women being raped and killed, which obviously was groundbreaking evidence for the prosecution. To them, this finally showed a clear motive for Michelle's murder. Although Michelle herself hadn't been sexually assaulted by the killer, to the prosecution, these searches proved that Jerry Burns's motive was still sexual. And so, of course, they wanted to be able to present this evidence to the jury during his upcoming trial. However, frustratingly, Jerry Burns's defense team was able to stop this from happening. They requested that the judge decide that this information about Jerry's search history be banned from the trial due to the fact that there was like 39 years between Michelle's murder and Jerry making these internet searches. They claimed that that meant that they weren't relevant to the case, essentially, and the judge apparently agreed, and it was deemed inadmissible in court. The prosecution were not allowed to bring that up as part of their argument against Jerry Burns. I personally don't understand that decision at all. I think these disturbing Google searches are completely relevant to Michelle's murder, but alas, that was the judge's decision. Jerry Burns's trial for murder took place in February of 2020, more than 4 decades after the crime. Now again, the prosecution's strongest and most damning piece of evidence was, of course, the DNA. The fact that Jerry Burns's DNA was found on both the gear shift in Michelle Martinko's car and on the black dress that she was wearing on the night that she was killed. That was irrefutable evidence against him. And the defense knew that. They knew that they couldn't deny that it was Jerry's DNA. However, they tried to claim that there could have been an innocent explanation for why Jerry's DNA was discovered. They claimed that it could have been the result of secondary DNA transfer. The defense called Dr. Michael Spence as a witness. Now, Dr. Spence worked as a molecular biologist, and he testified that it could have been possible that Jerry Burns's DNA could have been innocently transferred onto Michelle's dress. I mean, Jerry said that he had been to Westdale Mall a couple of times with his family, and whilst he couldn't recall having been there on the night that Michelle was killed, the defense argued that perhaps he was there the night before or something, and so was Michelle's real killer. Maybe Jerry Burns could have brushed past Michelle's killer, accidentally bumped into him or something, or coughed or sneezed on him, and thus his DNA transferred onto his clothing. And then when the killer attacked Michelle, Jerry's DNA from the killer's clothing transferred onto Michelle's dress. Or perhaps it wasn't through the killer. Maybe Jerry brushed past someone else that Michelle had interacted with on the night that she was killed, like someone at the choir banquet or someone at the mall, and that's how the secondary DNA transfer happened. The defense also argued that there may have also been an innocent explanation for Jerry's DNA being found on the gear shift in Michelle's car too, as apparently back in the 70s, Jerry Burns did work for a car dealership that sold Buick cars, and we know that Michelle was murdered in her family's Buick Electra car, so perhaps the Martinko family just happened to have brought their Buick Electra car from the same dealership that Jerry worked at. That was the defense's explanation for the DNA evidence, and of course the prosecution just thought that it was absolutely ludicrous, to be honest. It was ludicrous to suggest that Jerry's DNA on both Michelle's dress and the gear shift was there as a result of innocent secondary DNA transfer, especially because, as I understand it, the DNA evidence in question was blood. It was Jerry's blood that was found in the car and on the dress, where, as we discussed earlier, it's believed he'd cut himself during the violent struggle with Michelle. So yeah, the prosecution just did not believe that for 1 minute. You know, if they're gonna go down the route of secondary DNA transfer, then how come no one else's DNA was found in the car or on the dress? No one else that Michelle had interacted with that night. As we know, she saw her friends Tracy Price at the mall, she saw Kurt Thomas, she even ran into her ex Andy Seidel prior to her murder, and none of their DNA was found, and yet they spoke to Michelle one-on-one. Now, the prosecution also had a star witness testify during the trial. It was a man named Michael Allison, and he used to share a cell with Jerry Burns whilst he was kept in custody before his trial began. And Michael Allison said that one day he did try to ask Jerry if he did commit this murder. He asked Jerry, "Did you do the crime?" And Michael claimed that Jerry didn't really say yes or no. He didn't try to deny it. He just said, quote, "I can't talk about this." Michael Allison also informed the jury that on another occasion, Jerry apparently signed this newspaper for Michael, this newspaper which had an article about Michelle Martinko and Jerry's arrest on the front page. There was another occasion where he and Jerry were playing a game, I think like a card game or something, and apparently Michael kept beating Jerry at this game, and Jerry made a comment which really disturbed Michael. It was something along the lines of, "Oh, if you keep beating me, I'm gonna have to take you to the mall." And he also told Michael that whatever happened during his trial for Michelle's murder, whether he was found guilty or not guilty, he would still feel like he'd won anyway, because he'd gotten 40 years of freedom. He had 40 years with his wife and 3 children as a free man. Jerry Burns' trial came to a close on the 24th of February 2020, when the jury was sent off to deliberate, and it only took them about 3 hours in total to reach a verdict. And ultimately, they sided with the prosecution, and they found 67-year-old Jerry Burns guilty of the first-degree murder of Michelle Martinko. Finally, after 41 years, Michelle's killer had been convicted and justice was going to be served. And in August of 2020, Burns was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, so he was never getting out. He was going to die behind bars. Now, Jerry Burns' own family remain adamant, I believe to this day, that he is innocent. I don't think anyone in his family believes that he actually did this. Despite the evidence, they think that the police got it wrong. But the jury clearly thought otherwise, and Jerry Burns remains in prison. He did try to appeal against his conviction though, and this appeal was denied. Now, a lot of people believe that Michelle Martinko may not have actually been Jerry Burns' only murder victim. A lot of people consider him to be a good suspect in the case of Jodi Huizenfruit. Now, I have never covered Jodi's case myself, but it is a pretty infamous one. I'm sure many of you guys will recognize her. She was a 27-year-old TV news presenter, and she disappeared in Mason City in Iowa on the 27th of June 1995. And evidence outside of her apartment indicated that she had been abducted. However, to this day, nearly 30 years later, she has never been found, and I believe she was actually declared legally dead in 2001. And what's interesting is that on the day that Jerry Burns was arrested for Michelle's murder, before his arrest, whilst Detective Denglinger was asking him questions about the Michelle Martinko case, Jerry Burns just randomly brought up the kidnapping of Jodi Huizenfruit. He said something like, "Oh, I saw something in the news recently about Jodi's case," which just seemed so incredibly bizarre because, like I said, he was being asked questions about another case completely unrelated to Jodi's, and yet for some reason he brings up her abduction. So yeah, many people theorized that perhaps he was involved in Jodi's disappearance. I don't believe the police themselves have ever named him as a suspect in Jodi's case. I don't know if they've looked into him and ruled him out, but yeah, there is a lot of speculation that he could have been responsible. I've also seen speculation online that Jerry may have also been involved in the disappearance of his own cousin too. His cousin was a man named Brian Burns, and apparently he vanished on the 19th of December 2013, the same day that Michelle Martinko was killed, but obviously 34 years later. And 10 years after his disappearance in 2023, human remains were found in a field in eastern Iowa by pheasant hunters, later established to have been the remains of missing Brian Burns. Now, I believe the authorities were unable to tell exactly how Brian had died, likely due to how decomposed his remains would have been by this point. And police have said that there is no evidence to suggest that his cousin Jerry was involved in whatever had happened to him. But like I said, there is still speculation and rumours that he may have been. So do let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. Do you think that Jerry could have been involved in his cousin's death or Jody Husenfruit's case? Or do you think that there could have been other cases that Jerry Burns was responsible for that he just hasn't been linked to yet? And that concludes this case. That is the chilling case of Michelle Martinko. It really, really breaks my heart that Michelle's parents, Albert and Janet, were not around to finally see justice for their daughter. I mean, they died still believing that her ex Andy was responsible, which is awful, isn't it? Awful for them and awful for Andy. But yeah, although it took more than 4 decades, I'm sure the rest of Michelle's surviving family members were still so over the moon to finally have an answer and to finally see her killer put away for life. But yeah, that concludes this video. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case down below in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases. Again, feel free to pop them in the comments, or alternatively you can go through my case request form, which is always linked in the description box. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie.